My name is Hannah Storm. I'm the director of the Ethical Journalism Network, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion, Who Controls the Messengers? Regulating Journalism and Social Media while Protecting Free Speech. In a moment, I'll hand you over to our moderator, Meera Selva, your host for today's event. She's the Deputy Director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. But first, I'd like to say a real warm thank you on behalf of the Ethical Journalism Network for attending this event. We're a small UK-based charity that supports journalists around the world striving to uphold ethical practices in order to build trust in journalism. We rely on donations and project funding to do this, and if you would like to support us, to support journalists and to support trust in journalism, we'd be very grateful. You will have a link to a manner in which to donate in the emails you've received. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Meera Selva, and I will pick up at the back end of this panel for a goodbye and a thank you. Meera, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you for organising this amazing event. As Hannah said, I'm Deputy Director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I'm really delighted to be here on this panel, not least because everyone on the panel are people I've admired hugely for years. Carol Cadwallader is an investigative journalist for The Guardian and The Observer, and her investigation into Cambridge Analytica's links with Facebook sparked huge discussions about social media, elections, and who should be the gatekeepers to information. And this is rolling on and on today. I've been reading Carol's work for years, ever since she was a feature writer for The Observer, not least because she's from Wales, where I grew up. And the relationship between Wales, the European Union, and Brexit is one I also have a personal interest in. And then we have Alan Rusbridge, chairman of the Reuters Institute, the principal of Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, where he has pioneered access programs to get students from underprivileged backgrounds into the university. And before that, of course, as editor of The Guardian, where he really staked his reputation and the financial future on the newspaper on a bet that news should be high quality, freely available, and unafraid to investigate anything, including other newspapers. And Jillian York, Director for International Freedom for Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation in Berlin. She looks at state and corporate censorship and its impact on culture and on human rights, and has been a really important voice on speaking about how this impacts on marginalized communities. This panel is primarily about journalism, but also about information, gatekeeping, regulation, and free speech. As I'm sure everyone knows, Alan is a member of the Facebook Oversight Board, an experiment in corporate self-regulation, where a range of high-profile editors, thinkers, academics, civil society leaders have been asked to gather today to look at content taken down by Facebook. And Carol is a member of a group called the Real Oversight Board, Facebook Oversight Board, also made up of a group of high-profile editors, academics, thinkers, and civil society leaders who feel that things could and should be done differently. It's a real credit to both of them and the Ethical Journalism Network that we had them on this panel, and I really appreciate it. But I also would like to highlight that there are certain things that, Alan especially cannot mention just because of the role and the fact that a lot of things are ongoing. So I do ask for understanding on that. Gillian, can I just turn to you, please, because you've been looking at these issues from a different perspective, not necessarily just centered on the media, and to ask you how you view the kind of fairly fractious relationship between social media and journalism. And as someone who does look at censorship and access to information, what your immediate concerns are about what's happening at the moment.
Sure. So, I think that this is really interesting because I have been looking at this for a decade, and what we're seeing now, none of this is new. These companies have for a long time exercised significant control over our freedom of expression, and particularly as it pertains to journalism. And most of these companies, Google and Facebook in particular, long ago made commitments to freedom of expression and to operating within the human rights context, and they've not upheld that. So looking at where we're at right now, I think the two big news stories of the moment are Australia, and the way that Google and Facebook are responding there, and the way that Twitter is responding in India. And I see a really interesting kind of fracturing happening there that brings these companies sort of back to their roots where they were 8-10 years ago in their responses. Google, I think, is perhaps the most interesting one. They've really done a full flip from where they were in 2008 when they pulled out of China for similar kinds of pressure, or maybe more extreme pressure. I think that, I know we'll get into all the details, so I'll just keep it light for now. But overall, I think that we're at a really important point in this conversation, and that, we need to be looking at the way that these companies have operated historically, and hold them to account.
Okay. Alan, you talk Thank you, Jillian. Alan, you talk in your book, Breaking the News, about the kind of the tower and the town square and how journalism has fundamentally changed with the advent of the internet, and the idea that you stand at the top of the tower and shout down to with a megaphone to all the people below as a journalist or as an editor has now become everybody on the town square speaking at once, not being as deferential as they used to be. What do you think we've gained and what do you think we've lost in this kind of transition?
Well, at the moment we've got complete chaos of information. 4 billion people connected, probably half of those on Facebook. A great sense that nobody knows who to believe any longer. Massive distrust of the old gatekeepers. No way of knowing really how this is going to settle, how different notions of authority are going to settle, and no shared language. We use the term public square, we use the term platform, we use the term publisher, but these giant companies that have grown up aren't really any of those. There's no neat old word that fits this new entity. So what have we lost and what have we gained? Obviously as somebody who spent 40 years in journalism, I passionately believe in journalism. I think you need people who can say this happened, this didn't happen, this is true, that's not true, who can investigate power and be witnesses. I think that function should never go away and is as essential to me as ambulance drivers and police. But there's a huge problem in the economic model for that. There's a huge problem of trust. A lot of people just simply don't believe that any longer, or that role is necessary. And meanwhile, you've got the problems that I know we're going to talk about this evening that are inherent in these companies. But there's obviously been huge gains. The ability of people who never had a voice to have a voice now. And in many countries, Facebook and companies like it are the only equivalent to what the press used to do. And that ability to connect and collaborate and challenge is something that's immensely valuable. So I agree absolutely with Jillian that we're at a turning point, and it seems to me incredibly important that we get the next steps right.
Thank you very much. Carol, you've spoken very openly about what you see as the platform companies' impact on democracy, on the fair functioning of elections. Can I just ask you, I'm sure you've got lots of things you want to say, but can I just ask you specifically about whose job is it to protect elections and where journalism fits into this, essentially? Can journalists feed into this debate as well?
My personal experience is that I really feel that I hit against the limits of journalism. So, on the one hand, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica story had huge impact, and we saw there were these, regulatory actions around the world as a consequence of it. But we also see how actually that had no impact. So the fact that, I always go back to the fact that Facebook had this record fine as a result of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, £5 billion from the FTC. And on the day that Facebook got that fine, their share price actually went up because £5 billion means nothing to this company. And so it's really made me think. I've sort of spent a long time thinking about, well, actually, how do you hold Facebook? How do you hold the platforms to account in an age of no accountability? And that, I feel, is the sort of fundamental problem we're hitting up against, is that we currently have no means of holding them to account. And I think the thing which I found, the sort of particular place that I come to this from is that the platforms are currently seeking to regulate themselves. They are seeking to write the legislation to regulate themselves. And that is a problem. And I think, what we've witnessed in the last 24 hours really exposes the lie here. Facebook has been literally going out. Nick Clegg has been going out saying, God, write us some new laws. And then Australia does this, and they literally cut off news to the entire country, which is, you know, it's mob behavior. I mean,
well,
it's
to be fair, they haven't cut off news to the entire country. They've stopped carrying news on their platform.
They've stopped carrying news. They've stopped carrying evidence-based journalism to an entire country in the middle of a global pandemic that is marked by toxic mis and disinformation. And you know, I come at this and I hesitate around so much around this because I'm such an enormous admirer of everything that Alan did. And one of the things that he did was set up Guardian Australia. And one of the things he's done throughout his career is advocate for open journalism. And, you know, the idea that he's now being silenced on this critical issue is, I just, you know, I find it sort of disturbing. And I wish I wish, Alan, that you could speak out about it. And because I think, you know, you are such an important critical voice in this debate, and you have such a sort of body of knowledge that you could bring to it. So I guess what, anyway, sorry. I shall let Alan speak up. Sorry, I didn't want to take up too much.
Alan, did you want to respond?
Well, I don't feel I'm being silenced. I mean, Carol's completely right. And I have a horrible feeling we're going to agree on most things tonight, because I admire her and all that she's done as well. And I think it's great that the so-called real Facebook Oversight Board is there as well, alongside what the Facebook Oversight Board is doing. I mean, let's count the ways in which these giant tech companies have giant problems with accountability. You know, Carol's mentioned some of them. You know, they've got huge problems over their monopolistic tendencies, over tax, over privacy, over the work that Carol's done on political exploitation, over algorithmic secrecy, and over content. So there are massive areas where people have got to work, and I'm really glad that Carol's doing what she's doing. I'm doing one bit of that. I'm looking at content, and it would be terribly easy to be drawn. I mean, Facebook is so much in the news every day, every week, every year. And I get calls from journalists every 5 minutes saying, would you comment on this, this, or this? And I would rather just get on with the bit that I'm doing, which is the content bit. And I know Carol's going to do very well and all the rest.
Jillian, thank you. Can I just ask you about this issue of regulation? Because the original thinking behind this panel was to kind of think about who should be regulating social media and how. Because once you start getting into it, as you mentioned rightly, you know, there's an impact in India, there's an impact in Australia, there's an impact in Myanmar. And I feel very concerned that policies made in Western Europe and North America have different impacts around the world. But at the same time, it's clear that, you know, there is some kind of rules. Someone needs to know what the rules of the game are and write them. Who do you think that should be? And how should this process even begin?
No, I'm glad you asked. I think I jumped ahead a little bit. I was a little overeager on some points in my first comments. So let me take a step back and say that, you know, I mean, I think that I very much agree with the way that you phrased that these companies for a long time have had a lot of control from Silicon Valley and from the East Coast of the United States, to some degree Europe, but basically it's Westerners making up rules for the rest of the world and doing so quite badly. And yet at the same time, you know, I think that to the regulatory question, this is a really difficult problem. And I worry that a lot of the solutions that we're seeing right now, whether it's from Australia, from the UK, from Germany, and some of the conversations around Section 230 in the US, a lot of these are very nationalistic tendencies that are going to have negative impacts on people in other countries, just as these companies' rules long have. So we're really kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, where if we go to this self-regulation that we've, you know, as we've been seeing for more than a decade at this point, we're letting these people behind closed doors without, you know, pretty homogenous groups of people make up the rules for everyone. And yet, a lot of these laws being put in place in the West are also going to have that kind of negative impact. So there's not a great solution here in either direction. That's why I think that we need to rethink this from the ground up. This is what I propose in my book, and I can get into it at some point, but really, I mean, there has been a citizen-powered movement. I know right now Australia's heavy in the news. We're talking about the Facebook Oversight Board, but I think that, a lot of times the media tends to focus way too much on the issues happening in these, in Western countries, and not enough on what's going on elsewhere. And that's why I want to kind of point to the fact that there is, and has for a long time, been a citizen-powered civil society movement that's been trying to hold these companies accountable. And I think that we need to kind of look towards, UN human rights frameworks and the frameworks that global civil society is trying to put forth.
Thank you. I'm going to start taking questions as well. And I think, as James has said to the participants, if you type the questions into him, he'll filter them over through to me as well. So he can't type to me directly. Can I just get this question from Daniel Bauer, which kind of leads on from your point, Jillian? So at the end of last year, Francis Fukuyama advocated for a market of algorithmic middleware as a regulatory response to social media and digital platforms. And this would then give users of social media more choice in how their feeds were ordered. What do you think about this as a policy solution? I'll put that to all of you, but do you want to start, Jillian?
Sure. Yeah, I actually, I had the pleasure of debating him on a news site called Paragraph, with an I in there, a couple of weeks ago about this. And it was kind of a new concept to me until I looked at it and said, oh no, actually this is interoperability. This is stuff that, EFF and Cory Doctorow in particular have been talking about for a long time, which is the idea that we should be able to port our data elsewhere, that we should be able to, work cross-platform. And so I think it's one idea in the toolbox, and it's an important one. But it's not going to solve all of the problems, right? I think that that's the one thing that I'm going to probably say a lot of times tonight, is that none of these solutions that come up are going to be a panacea. But I think that the idea of middleware, as framed as interoperability, is a really important one that we should be looking at.
Carol.
I'm here to listen. I'm afraid I don't know enough about that, but it sounds fascinating.
Alan, do you have a...
It reminds me of the debates that I was listening to sort of 5 or 6 years ago about privacy, really, and the idea of being able to get a much firmer grip on your own privacy and who has the data on you, and what's not to like about that. I assume it's really difficult to implement, otherwise people would have implemented it. But I do think that my instincts are the backlash against the giant data grab that so many people have gone in for is coming. We're witnessing it now, but I assume it's just really hard to implement.
If I may, it's not that it's so hard technically; it's that the companies don't want this to happen. Right?
That too.
That's really what it comes down to: is these companies resisting that sort of thing because it impacts their bottom line, which is what they're all about.
Also, presumably the algorithm is never neutral. It's got the biases of whoever's writing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And Alan, this is one for you. It's about kind of distribution of news, which I think is the issue at the heart of the kind of debate about social media platforms and journalism, from Stephen Kinsella, which is, if we have company A who invests in producing content, and I really don't like the word content, Mr. Fire Noble saying this is a reframing of the debate as well. But anyway, if invest in producing content wants to be able to decide how it is rewarded for it, and company B who says it's doing company A a favor by making that content freely available to the customers of company B, who should we instinctively believe and support?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the bit that I'm sort of steering clear of. I mean, I'm aware of the issue, and I listen to people on the radio, and I listen to Google saying, look, we're not stealing the company, we're just sending links. I listen to Facebook saying, look, nobody's obliged to carry our stuff. We're not publishing the stuff. It's stuff that people are sharing. And I listen to people saying the opposite. Luckily, I'm not in that game any longer, and I don't have to decide. I mean, it is the problem. And I may well repeat myself tonight as well. If this was Gutenberg 1450, we're about sort of 1457 at the moment, and we know a lot of amazing things happened between 1450 and 1550, and so we're really in the foothills of this stuff, in which we can't agree a lot of the terminology. We don't know how things work. We don't know how this algorithm works. We don't know whether echo chambers exist or not. We can't find the right language to describe these platforms. And so this question of who owes whom what, which seems to be at the heart of the Australian question, it is something that cleverer people than I understand better than I do.
Thank you. Carol, do you have a take on that?
I'm really sorry, Meera, I didn't quite get the question.
It's a long-winded way of saying, if company A is producing the content and company B is saying, we can, we are able to get this to your customers and make it freely available, so we're allowed to help you distribute your stories. Who should we as readers, viewers, instinctively support? The people producing the work or the ones who are getting it to us?
I mean, are we talking about the sort of, the old one is that the platform is a platform, not a publisher, in that
kind of, yeah.
For it. I mean, I do feel that's a busted flush, I have to say. I mean, I'm not a policy person, and there's a lot of very smart brains thinking about Section 230 and all the rest of it. But I think instinctively we can see that in so many ways, there are decisions being taken by humans at these companies that are having profound editorial consequences. And I mean, and one of those, for example, is the question of algorithmic amplification. And this is, for me, is like one of the biggest problems of the Oversight Board, for example, is the fact that Facebook, in setting it up and prescribing its terms and references of what it can look at, has given it this tiny, tiny, narrow remit that actually precludes many of the bigger questions. And one of the biggest issues we know over the last year in the US has been the thing around algorithmic amplification. And that is, that we know it's been its own recommendation engines which have got out this content, this QAnon conspiracy theories to such a vast number of people, with the consequences. So, in that, Facebook needs to take responsibility for that. And that is an editorial function. And I really hope that in the coming months, we are going to see it being held to account for some of that that's happened. But that's not going to happen through the Oversight Board, because it's not allowed to look at those issues.
I don't know if it's not allowed or it's not, I think Alan said before, I'll quote him, but he has said, well, this is the start of a process. So, you've been given one set of powers and then the idea is that they build. So I don't know if, but I think you just raised a really important point. I will come back to Alan, but I just want to bring Jillian here on misinformation, because I run the Journalist Fellowship Program, and there's a lot of conversation about misinformation. And sometimes I do end up saying, can we stop? Can we also talk about news gathering and storytelling and journalism? Because if journalists sit in newsrooms and just constantly fact check and fight misinformation, it's a great public service in one hand, but on the other hand, no journalism gets done and nothing else gets investigated. Jillian, can you tell me a bit again where you think the kind of solutions to this kind of wave of misinformation might lie?
Yeah, I mean, I think people will hate this one, but in schools. So, part of the, I mean, I do agree that algorithmic amplification is a problem here. And I think that we do have to look at how this content is being monetized. I think we have to view this as a problem of the business model. And yet at the same time, I find the misinformation conversation, especially in the US, so frustrating because most of the misinformation that I was taught, I learned in American public schools. So, I mean, to be honest, I think that the troublesome bit here is that we're talking about misinformation in a very specific context, and yet there's other stuff that just will never be part of the limits of what what these companies will be mandated to say or to allow or not allow, and to really put a fine point on it. Like, I don't see these companies regulating the idea of whether you can say that Columbus discovered America, for instance. So sorry, I mean, I know I'm getting off on a tangent here, but the misinformation conversation I find so narrow and frustrating, and I understand that these are big problems, but there's this tendency towards techno-solutionism. We see, I think a lot of society and a lot of our lawmakers right now see the way of dealing with this as, okay, let's just regulate the problem away through telling companies what they can or cannot host, or creating laws around what can or cannot be said. And yet I think that, this is a quick and easy fix to a much, much bigger problem. And I agree. I don't think that, spending the day fact checking is necessarily the right way to go about it either.
I mean, Alan, if you were running a newspaper again, or even when you were running the newspaper, what kind of weight did you put to basically fact checking, not your own stories, but, you know, if there's a story doing the rounds, which is patently false, how much time and energy and, you know, resources should newsrooms put into this? Because I can't find this fascinating on a day-to-day level.
Well, that's the whole of journalism, isn't it? The whole of journalism is fact checking, working out what's true and what isn't true. I mean, of course, journalists have to be fact checkers for the internet and for the political process in general, though I worry about it slightly because it takes up so much time when they could be doing something else, you know, chasing after other people's untruths. And I think Steve Bannon realized that when he came up with this phrase, flood the zone with shit, you know, because you just create such chaos that you've got the journalists sliding around in the shit trying to work out what's true and what's not. And all the time they're doing that, they're not chasing proper stories. I think Jillian's right that the scale of this is so vast, it has to begin in schools, and it has to begin with each of us taking responsibility for the information and for our skepticism and our ability to try and work out what's true and what's not true. That's clearly, but that's a long project. Just to sort of circle back a bit on what Carol was saying and the Section 230 debate. Again, I think it's a problem with language. Clearly, these organizations are not just platforms. And it's easy to say they're obviously publishers, but they're obviously not publishers in the sense that publishers were publishers. I mean, what they're doing is different, if only because of the scale and because of the latitude of the kind of information that I think we should be allowing. You know, freedom of information of expression is incredibly messy. And that leads to the sort of third bit of this, which is, we know anybody who's been involved in freedom of expression knows that this has been a 300-year struggle, 350-year struggle, and that God knows we haven't solved that yet, but that you have to be incredibly delicate about how you resolve these issues. And obviously we don't want Mark Zuckerberg to be the arbiter of what we know and what we don't know. And obviously in most cases, we don't want Modi or Erdogan or you know, even supposedly nice governments. We know the problems with governments controlling information. And so what we're tiptoeing through is trying to find the problem, the solution to not Zuckerberg and not governments. And at the moment we call it self-regulation. I'm not sure the Facebook board will look like self-regulation in about 5 years' time, because actually it will have completely de-anchored itself from Facebook, and you know, the charges that people throw at us at the moment, we've all been handpicked, etc., will become less and less true, and it will have more of a feeling of independent regulation rather than self-regulation. It may not work, but I think I think you just have to give it time. It's one answer. I'm pretty impressed with it so far. It may not work, and that there's lots else that Carol and her colleagues can do as well, which will be as important, if not more important.
Can I jump in there, Alan? Because it's sort of, somebody said something to me earlier, and it did make me think about it, which was that the thing that Facebook has done in Australia, in the sense of just turned off access to news on its platform, you know, that this has been done by a company. If this was the Australian government that did it, if this was state power, do you think that we'd be looking at this in a different way? And when we think about that, when we think about this enormous monopoly power that Facebook has exerted in doing that, I mean, the thing that disturbs me is this, that the members of the Oversight Board, who are hugely respected, brilliant people in their field, are giving legitimacy to this company, which is carrying out indefensible acts like this. And I think the thing I sort of really feel about the way that we've seen Facebook behave in so many respects is that it is a bad faith actor. And I think that all of you who are doing this on good faith, and that I feel is the disconnect. And I feel that particularly, I suppose, having been at the sharp end of having dealt with Facebook over this particular story.
Yeah, if you think that, Carol, I'm sorry you think that. I don't.
It's a question. It's a question. Does it not? I mean, yeah.
I don't think that. I wouldn't be doing it if I thought that. Obviously, I think what I'm doing is and what we're doing is something useful in trying to, and Jillian touched on this earlier, because it's very easy to have a very westernized view of the problem. But there are lots of people in different countries who think of Facebook very differently. They think that, you know, they haven't got a free press. They live in very repressive circumstances where freedom of information is not flourishing. And somebody has to come in and work out how to protect freedom of information globally to the highest possible standards, and try and enforce the highest standards of human rights. And I think that's an honorable thing to be trying to do. The problem in Australia is at least three-sided. You've got a government, you've got the Murdoch press, and you've got the tech companies, and it's a bit of a knife fight at the moment. And you mentioned Guardian Australia, which I did start, and that was responsible. That was a response to a very different kind of monopolistic problem in Australia, which is the Murdoch press, which is a really serious problem in democracy. And it's partly because of the problems with the old gatekeepers that social media has been to some an escape and something of great value. And we have to hold that. And I think I'm probably prepared to cut Facebook and the other companies more slack, because I think that there are valuable things that they're doing. I don't see them as evil incarnate, as I think sometimes you do. And so I think it's important that somebody holds that.
If I can, but I mean, you know, I think the way that you talk about the balancing of, you know, free speech and free expression and how delicate that is, I fundamentally agree with. But I think the particular thing with Facebook, and actually with the Guardian and Observer, is just that this is a company that has absolutely tried everything to evade journalistic accountability. And actually, in the specific context of Britain, Facebook has done everything possible to evade parliamentary accountability. Mark Zuckerberg, after all, I mean, he can't even step foot on British soil, I don't think. Otherwise, he faces a potential summons, because, you know, he refused repeatedly to come to Britain to answer questions, including about what happened in the Cambridge, what Facebook actually did with what it knew about the Cambridge Analytica data scandal, and also how its platform was used in the referendum. I mean, that is still complete darkness. They refused to hand over, you know, this vital evidence from this fundamental election that is going to change British history forever. And that sort of, that slipperiness, that evasiveness, that refusal to answer to, you know, the lawmakers of our country, I do think that does put it into a special case. And I do think that as I sort of said, is that it's not acting in good faith in these instances.
I mean, I'm going to ask Jillian here, because I think you do want to come in there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, go on. And I had a question for you as well.
Sure. No, go ahead. I can.
It was about Carol's point about basically corporate accountability, and who, again, it's going back to who regulates. But in this case, should there be laws that oblige platform companies to divulge details of their members, of their algorithm? You know, how much information should be made public in these cases? How much of this could be seen as in the public interest and the public good, and how much should they be allowed to keep hold of in the name of corporate sensitivity?
All right, so I will answer that. I want to go back just a second, respond to a couple of things, and then I'll end with that. So I just to a couple of Alan's points, I mean, I think it is really, really important to remember the role that Facebook plays in the rest of the world. And one of the conversations that I get really frustrated by that was trending here in Germany today is the, boycott Facebook or delete Facebook thing, as if that's just going to solve it miraculously. I mean, if we look at like why Facebook was such a big deal in Myanmar, part of it was because Facebook pushed itself into the country by making deals with the telcos there to allow free access to users in that country through, through their mobile phones. And so they popularized themselves through these backroom deals. And that, that puts them in a really interesting position in that country. In India, India did push back against this, but in Tunisia and a handful of other places. So Facebook wants to be everything. It doesn't want to just be the platform or the publisher. It also wants to be the infrastructure. And I think that that's an important point here as well. And, I find that also, I just want to comment on a couple of the oversight board things, although I know we'll get back there. I'm not going to get into so much what I think about it. You can ask me later if you want, but I think that, one of the problems that I have with the emphasis on the conversation about the oversight board is that it is kind of a bit of a deflection. I think that, again, it's one tool in the arsenal, and I'm not completely against it. But I think one of the important things to remember here is that, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't believe in free speech. Whatever the people on the oversight board sure do, but Zuckerberg does not. He never has. He launched this platform from the very beginning with ideas that were completely against concepts like anonymity, against sexual and female body expression. And so those are all important things to remember, as we talk about accountability, that these are the ideologies of a young man at Harvard that are still persisting to this day. And so whenever we think about it in this context, I think it's important to talk about that. I also think Facebook's reform push right now is disingenuous, but I can come back to that as well. But to your question around corporate accountability, I mean, I do think that we should be pushing these companies toward transparency, and that's what we are seeing being pushed through with the Digital Services Act in Europe, hopefully this year. I personally, I'm going to speak for myself rather than my organization on this one so that I don't cross any lines. I personally think that we, the best regulatory frameworks would be forcing these companies to be more transparent about their, what's behind the algorithms, about what they take down and why, about ensuring that they're notifying every user in every circumstance. And frankly, I want to see users having to go through a consent process every single time the rules change. It's ridiculous to me that the only time I consented to the rules at Facebook were when I was, 1 year out of university in 2004 when I first joined. So all of that, and then I think also, just on one of the other measures too here is just remembering that when we're looking at the way that these companies operate, there's also really, just so much is being put on these individuals in the Global South who have to decide, mostly in the Global South, also, in the US, but not very well paid, who have to make these really quick decisions about all of this speech. And so anytime we're talking about regulation or self-regulation, I think it's really important to remember who's being forced to clean up the internet for the rest of us out here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to bring it back to journalism again and kind of the business model of journalism, because the fundamental issue is that, like Alan said, the business model for journalism is broken partly by the platform companies and also crucially the choices advertisers have made to move their money elsewhere, move it away from the news organizations into the platforms. And there's a question from Venya Vijaygunawardena. Sounds like Sri Lankan. What do you think the role of advertisers is or can be in holding these platforms accountable in a meaningful way? And last summer, a huge number of advertisers pulled media spend from Facebook, but this had little impact on their bottom line, and the money's gone back. So do you think there's anything that the companies themselves can do here? Alan, let's start with you there.
Yeah, it's always open to any advertisers to say, I don't want to be in this environment. It's happened in print. I mean, the News of the World, which was a story that the Guardian did, the phone hacking at the News of the World, was effectively finished off by Murdoch after the advertisers just said, we don't want to be in the News of the World, we don't want to be associated with it. And that's always been there as a threat to mainstream publishers as well as to Facebook. And I think if you have multiple companies saying, actually, we think this company is so problematic, we don't want to be there, they could have a remarkable effect.
Carol, did you?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think I certainly used to hope that, and that increasingly advertisers would come to understand that they were operating in what's essentially an unsafe environment in many respects. And it was, I mean, it was sort of amazing to watch, I think, wasn't it, in the summer when these huge companies took that decision to support the civil rights organizations who organized Stop Hate for Profit. But there was real limitations on it in terms of the effect that it had. I think, to be honest with you, it was another wake-up call that I think there had been sort of hope pinned upon that actually market forces can affect change at these companies. And what we realized was, well, actually, no, that's not true either. So at the moment, we don't have meaningful regulation. We don't have legislation. Market actually can't regulate it. There is nothing. And actually, the decisions are still very much being concentrated in one figure at this company. And there seems to be no sort of formal mechanism of holding to account other than public shaming. And I think that's one of the sort of most interesting things, is that is all we've been left with. And that's, I think, with the body that I became involved with, which involves many of the members of the Stop Hate for Profit coalition, the civil rights organizations in America, were desperately worried about their members who were most vulnerable and most at risk in terms of what was happening around the election. And, they, last resort, came together with these academics to form the Real Facebook Oversight Board ahead of the election, because run out of other options. And that's a sort of, I think that's an extraordinary and frightening realization, actually.
I think there's an extraordinary situation where social media is ubiquitous, pervasive, global, affecting millions of people. And yet, like you said, it's focused very much on individual personalities. Gillian, this seems the perfect moment to ask you what you think of the Facebook Oversight Board and Real Oversight Board. You said you had thoughts.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the frustrating thing about the conversation, and I mean, with much respect to both of you for what you're doing here, is that it does completely push aside the fact that there is a global civil society movement that has not just been publicly shaming these companies, but also consulting with them, convincing them behind closed doors, pushing them over the years. I mean, we wouldn't have things like transparency reporting. We wouldn't have appeals at Facebook if it were not for the pushes of global civil society. And particularly, a lot of this work is led by folks in the global South. And I think I have to keep emphasizing that. So I don't really believe that public shaming is all we're left with, as someone who's been on the phone with these companies for 11 years at this point. That said, what do I think about the Facebook Oversight Board? Like I said, I do think it's a tool in the arsenal, but I think that it's been overplayed as the tool. I don't think Alan thinks that, and I don't think a lot of the folks on the board think that, but Mark Zuckerberg sure does think that. And we should always be really wary of what he thinks. My particular criticisms of it are that it's 25% US American. I think that was absolutely fundamentally wrong. And I was in one of the consultations while the Oversight Board was being built, and everyone in the room said that that would be wrong, and they did it anyway. So I want to emphasize that, Facebook did not listen to what people told them to do and not to do. I also am very concerned with the fact that, as it currently stands, there isn't really case law being built around these issues. So, the Oversight Board has made some really good decisions so far in the cases that they've been given, but those decisions are not going to trickle down. I hope that Alan's right, that the Oversight Board will change these things over the years. I hope that it will diversify and become more global. And I guess my last concern is, they purposely didn't really put very many content moderation experts on the board. There's no former content moderators on the board. And these were all deliberate decisions by the company, I think. And so, as much as I hope that it does become a more important tool in the arsenal and that it changes over the years, I'm still a skeptic.
And what about the real oversight board?
I think it's also a tool in the arsenal. I don't think it's the only thing in the arsenal. And I, again, I think that public shaming is one way to deal with this stuff, but I think that it, saying that that's all we're left with, I don't agree with that. There are a lot of really brilliant minds on the board, Carol, as well as many of the other folks there. And I think a lot of them are doing really important work in this space. I personally have chosen to kind of stick independent. I didn't really pursue either option because I think that, we need critical voices from outside of all of these frameworks as well. And, I'm generally just not a joiner.
Thank you. Can I ask what's coming down the line? Because it's also a generational thing. And we all know that Facebook is also really for, well, I don't know how old you are, Jillian, but for our age, my kids are not on Facebook and would laugh at the idea of it. And it's a question from Kate DePuri, which is, what extent do you think the young news users already don't make this distinction between platform and news publisher? And do we need to rescue that situation, or does it not matter? And in a way, how does this feed into how we see news and the regulation of social media? Because there is we're still a kind of pre-digital age. We had a kind of pre-digital experience and a digital experience, and the generations coming up are just online. The idea of screen breaks and being offline is just anathema. So the idea of kind of regulating is also different, I think, there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I am the youth voice on this one, although I've had the internet since I was 11, but I'm 38, I'll say it. And, I've had Facebook since a year after I was out of university. But I didn't, I've never really used it as my news outlet. I definitely, I joined Twitter pretty early in 2008 and have been reliant on Twitter for my news for many years. So, as well as like the papers and magazines that I subscribe to. But I do think it's interesting looking at this from a generational perspective, because the folks 10 years younger than me, I don't know that they've necessarily picked up a physical paper. I think a lot of folks in that age group, and I guess we're calling them Zoomers these days, are reliant on social media and don't see these lines between traditional media and citizen journalism. And so, I came to this space through Global Voices, which is a platform that started in, I think, 2004 or 5, founded by Rebecca McKinnon and Ethan Zuckerman, to look at what the world was saying when the world was talking on blogs. And then they quickly had to figure out how to talk about, what people were saying on social media. And over the years, we've seen those lines really blur. I personally, I find that we're in a difficult moment here because on the one hand, I don't think that the state should define who's a journalist. I mean, I'm sure that folks would agree with that generally. But, I also think that we're losing trust in mainstream media at the same time that we're also like trying to figure out, who gets to be a journalist and who gets to be a voice. And I think that the younger generation doesn't really see that line as much. And that's both positive and worrisome at the same time.
Alan, do you want to comment on that? Because, I remember Georgina Henry starting Comment is Free as a blogging platform on a mainstream newspaper. And it did become who, is this journalism, is this not? Who's speaking? What's the point of having, how important is it to keep the brand and have a values attached to a media brand?
Well, one of the things that interests me at the moment, and in a way my most recent book, News and How to Use It, looks at this. So the journalism now exists in a context which is completely different from even 20 years ago. I mean, we were the gatekeepers. We owned the printing presses. We owned the broadcasting studios. If you wanted news, you effectively had to come to us. Then this thing called the internet happened, and billions of people started creating news, and journalists. A lot of journalists, quite understandably, and because it was destroying their livelihoods as well, were horrified by it, and they have never come to terms with it. They hate it, they disparage it, and they can see no good in it. I think there are two problems with that. One is that there evidently is good stuff there. And it's pointless to deny it. I think we could learn from it. And the second thing is, unless we can learn from it and persuade people that journalism exists as a separate category of better stuff, that professional news is so much better than that sea of information out there, which is chaotic and rubbish, then journalism is not going to survive. And I don't think journalists are thinking hard enough about that. I don't think they're thinking hard enough about what public service journalism performs, about how journalism is seen, and about what the craft of journalism is involved in. I mean, let's take climate change as the subject, which I think a lot of journalism has done really, really badly. I'm astonished. I'm still astonished at the way. I think it's getting a bit better, but I'm astonished by the people who get to write about climate change in mainstream media. And I think, why would you do that just on a commercial basis? If you're trying to persuade people that journalism is better and a craft aside of all this rubbish, why would you have James Dellingpole writing about climate change in numerous British newspapers when he doesn't believe in it? And the young people I know say, well, I wouldn't bother to read newspapers because I don't trust them on an issue like that. Multiply that by 100, or the issues about the proprietors or the people who get peerages from, and these people who still have to see themselves as gatekeepers and can't tell the difference between what's a fact and what's a comment. There's so much that needs to be sought out about journalism if journalism is to lift itself above what it sees as this disreputable realm of social media. So I think everybody has to think a bit more carefully about what's going on, and to be a bit subtler about acknowledging that the good in both in professional journalism and in social media, and learn a bit more from each other.
I mean, Carol, you're the only journalist in a newsroom at the moment, and you're also in a kind of fairly unique situation in that you are in an established newsroom, but you also have a tremendous presence on social media, and you also really have a very strong personal brand. How much of the points that Alan's just raised do you think about on a day-to-day basis, especially in terms of how you connect with the younger readers?
I mean, it was sort of fascinating to hear Alan talk about that, and to talk about these kind of very fundamental issues, which, as he says, most sort of jobbing journalists don't really think about on a day-to-day level. And I mean, I think it's as I sort of say, interestingly, is that I kind of do sort of refer to it as I've kind of like underwent a sort of slight process of radicalization, in the sense of as I was talking about, of like really questioning the point of journalism. If the point of it is to hold power to account, what does it mean when you can't hold power to account? And therefore, is journalism doing the right things in the right way? Is there another way? Are there extra ways of doing journalism, impact journalism differently? And that's actually the thing that I'm sort of, for the last 9 months, have very much been experimenting with this new organisation, the Citizens, that I'm involved in. And it's really looking at, it's absolutely focused on public interest journalism, but it's saying that actually we need the skills from elsewhere. We need creative storytellers, we need filmmakers, we've got people from advertising, we've got brilliant social media creators. And it's one of the things we're trying to do is this sort of experimentalist approach, which is really that it's, as I love The Guardian and Observer. I've loved writing for it. It's an amazing news organisation. But so much of the time you do feel that you will write an article and concerned Guardian readers will read it and nothing will happen, because we are so embedded inside these bubbles now. And so I've been really thinking how you do break out of that, how you do try and do journalism which is across the spectrum and reaches different audiences and reaches younger people. And that's sort of, essentially I've been involved in a kind of series of experiments around all of these things. And because I think we have really witnessed how bad things can get and how much worse they may get, and what it means actually when we've seen this weakening of news organizations. We've seen them being under-resourced. I mean, I come from this, from having sort of carried out this investigation and not having, there wasn't the money for a team of journalists behind that. And it was about sort of reaching out really as well to find other people academics and others who could contribute. And I just sort of, it's in all of our interests that we find ways to fund journalism, that we find ways to expand the audience, because as you say, Meera, it's like the young people who are looking at the internet, there's this sort of great flattening and they don't care, essentially. So
yeah, but
I think this sounds great, Carol, and I mean, my experience now that I'm not sort of inside institutional journalism, and one of the reasons why I hesitate just to put the boot in completely to these social media companies is I enjoy Twitter much more now than when I was editing, because nobody cares who I am.
Oh, they do.
But I find people who really know what they're talking about with things like law and science and climate change. I'm interested in the law because I was always being sued, and there are some brilliant lawyers who are on Twitter writing really knowledgeably and expertly. And what I notice is that their way of earning trust is not to say I'm a QC, I have a fancy wig, or they use very 21st century techniques of trust, so that they will advance a proposition, maybe even a preposition. They will put a link in, they'll put a screenshot. Here's my evidence. This is why I'm saying what I'm saying. And by the way, if you don't like what I'm saying, please come and challenge me, and I'll have that conversation with you here and now. If I get something wrong, please tell me, and I'll correct it instantly, because if I don't correct something instantly, you're not going to trust me. I find that fascinating, because it's the opposite of how so many journalists still behave. Journalists hate putting links into anything. They hate putting footnotes or saying, they love anonymous sources. Trust me, I've spoken to this person. I'm not going to tell you who that person is, but you're just going to have to trust me because I work for the Daily Beast. They're hopeless at going out and mixing it and debating things with people. They really, they feel, I've done that bit. I hated it. Our readers are morons. Please don't ask me to engage with them. And have you ever tried to get an apology out of a newspaper? So I think we're both saying that there are very liberating aspects of the best of social media from which journalists could learn, and which could lead to genuine change and power, which I sense you're finding rather exhilarating, because you like the possibilities of that.
Well, I think it's so interesting that you use the legal Twitter and the sort of example as the thread, as you put it, as a sort of bold, innovative new form of journalism, because I totally agree with you. I mean, I actually think the Twitter thread is a really understudied form of journalism.
It's amazing.
Actually. And it's, what else I love as well, which also, like, a lot of journalists are completely sort of snobby about, is, open source investigators. I mean, there's a battalion of people out there who are doing really brilliant, open source researching. And as long as you publish, as you sort of said, if just, they're putting down their evidence. And so it's for anybody else to check, to sort out. And I think there has been a real resistance among the sort of journalistic community to feel that this is kind of, sort of amateur hour over here, and it's not what we do. And I think I think I agree with you. It's just sort of like, I feel that it's the thing about to expand the community and look at, these are sort of grassroots forms, which is that, and to go to the thing that Jillian was saying, which is that if we can, there is so much to be done in terms of that. This is teaching the skills of evidence-based journalism is it's good for everybody. And I was talking to a political scientist the other day, and she was sort of saying that QAnon is a sort of distortion in a way of investigative journalism. You've got these people who kind of have really loved digging into these things and sort of figuring out these links, but they don't have the basics of sourcing and evidencing and all the rest of it. So I do feel that there is something perhaps there in widening the community of understanding of journalism, which would be just sort of fundamentally helpful and democracy strengthening.
I have to jump in here as the non-journalist.
Jump in, Jillian, yeah.
So, I mean, I'm going to be perfectly frank. I made my career on Twitter. You know, I wouldn't be where I am right now if I hadn't been, you know, fact checking and tweeting and amplifying other people's voices, particularly during the Arab Spring a decade ago. And the reason that I was able to do that was simply that I had connections in Egypt when the internet was shut down. And I wouldn't have gotten, you know, and I document all of this in my book, but I wouldn't be where I am if I hadn't been playing that role, and often playing the role as fixer and fact checker and all of that. And I was doing that because I was interested in it, not because I was a journalist, and not because I necessarily considered myself an expert. But over the years, and you're gonna see how I'm gonna link this back to Section 230. Over the years, you know, I've found myself kind of in a weird role. I do write a lot of op-eds. I've written for Comment is Free. I've written for a lot of other papers. But I don't see myself as a journalist. And yet, you know, I'm looking at like the way that journalists are covering social media and covering these topics. And I can name maybe 2 journalists who get Section 230 right. Every single week, there's another publication that explains Section 230 incorrectly. And so I think that it's really, really important that journalists are paying attention to what the experts are saying on these matters. I think that one of the most frustrating things about the content moderation debate is that we're overly focused on the voices of lawyers and academics, and not on the people who've been in this fight for a decade. And I'm not talking about myself. I get quoted plenty, but again, like global civil society, people who've worked in these fields. There tends to be this like, let's go to the same 5 people who can comment on this. There's, you know, again, poor explanations of how the law works. Sometimes the New York Times gets 230 wrong all the time, regularly. And Mike Masnick's, you know, pointing this out on Tech Dirt every week or so. And that's his job, not mine. But nevertheless, you know, I mean, I think that I agree with Alan's comment that journalists aren't thinking hard enough about their role in the public sector. And when we talk about content moderation in particular, I think that I think journalism could do a lot better than constantly cycling through these same stories. And often, again, the stories of the West, because that's maybe what they think their readers are interested in. But to me, those are, again, not the most important stories of what's happening on social media.
Yeah, that's
Meera, can I just I just reviewed Elliot Higgins's book for the TLS, and it is an astonishing story. You know, he was the archetypal nerd in the spare bedroom with a computer, and he's now in an organization with £1 million turnover and employing 18 full-time journalists, and has become, you know, an astonishing generator of scoops by, in a way, doing the opposite of what journalists are doing. So it comes back to what Carol was saying. It's not, here's my scoop, I'm going to protect it. It's here's an interesting piece of information. Anyone want to join me in looking at this? And everything is transparent and open source. And it's a very, very powerful way of doing journalism.
And also the other thing that Bellingcat do so brilliantly as well is they collaborate. You know, I find like the whole notion of a scoop just so old-fashioned and outdated and sort of useless, is that if you have a scoop in this day and age, it means that nobody else is covering it and the story gets no traction and it dies. It's like you need the sort of anti-scoop, it feels to me, in terms of like breaking through. And I think, you know, it's certainly, so to go to your point, Jillian, which I totally agree with, I mean, it's a sort of fundamental problem which we knock up against all the time. How do you make America, particularly the US media, you know, these technology companies based in Silicon Valley, they only pay attention to the US media. They only pay, you know, real attention to the US Congress. So it's sort of like that challenge of how do you bring the rest of the world to the US to make them care about it? Because I mean, I did find it sort of incredibly salutary in terms of the reporting that I was doing, that we were in Britain, you know, we speak the same language, we share the same media, you sort of think that we have some purchase there, but we don't. And I absolutely believe that the Cambridge Analytica Facebook story would have been ignored by Facebook. They would have been able to ignore it if it hadn't been for the fact that actually we did also partner with the New York Times, who, you know, took it really seriously, and that sort of brought them to the table and made it unignorable. But I think these really old-fashioned ideas about sort of scoops and exclusives are sort of, I just think we need to get rid of them. I think they don't work anymore.
I agree with all of that, but I got to say, like, being based in Germany, I don't think that the European media does much on the global South either. I don't think that they do enough. I mean, I do think, you know, European media, British media in particular, does tend to be better at focusing on things like, you know, Cambridge Analytica, of course. And I completely agree with your criticism of the Silicon Valley press. But, you know, if it weren't for Reuters, the stories about Myanmar wouldn't have been told. A lot of that stuff was completely underreported, and Facebook didn't take it seriously until the Reuters investigative piece in 2018 that came, you know, after the UN investigation there. So yeah, and I'm glad to see that India is getting as much attention this week as it is. The situation with Twitter in India is really interesting. I don't know if we're going to get to that, but yeah, I overall feel that there's still so many underreported stories.
Well, this would be a very, very good moment to get to that, because the situation at Twitter in India is extraordinary. It is one platform company capitulating to a kind of fairly authoritarian government. And you mentioned earlier, Carol, about, you know, that, you know, if a government had decided to take down news, you know, would there be outcry? That's essentially what has happened in India in many ways, and it hasn't created much of an outcry.
And, you know, I kind of was you know, I go back to this thing, which is I did there's a program, I think the Foreign Office does, where it brings journalists from particularly the subcontinent to Britain, where they sort of do, you know, a sort of fellowship. And I had a meeting with them shortly after, actually, we did the Cambridge Analytica story in 2018. And it was, you know, it was really salutary listening to them, because they were dealing with these massive problems of technology that was absolutely pervasive through the government, through the ruling party, and these like really tight relationships. And you know, and this is what I mean, is that sort of like, I find it impossible getting answers out of Facebook's press office. They had no chance whatsoever. And this is where I sort of feel, one of the things when I go to the US and have done sort of talks with journalists there, I do keep on saying is that, you know, there is this, we sort of have this debt, that there is a responsibility. I mean, you're right, Jillian, the European media too, but the US media in terms of the US companies is so much more important. And I do feel there is this sort of like global allyship, which is required, that we need to bring these stories and put them in the faces of the tech companies. And you're right, you know, that is what Reuters did with Myanmar, but that is only, and, you know, we're seeing like there's been brilliant Wall Street Journal reporting on Facebook in India, but it's still the tip of the iceberg. It's still really difficult to get covered. But that is, I think that's one of the huge challenges for journalism, which we have to crack essentially, because the abuses of power elsewhere are, you know, kind of incredible.
Yeah, and I mean, with what we're seeing with India and Twitter right now, what I find so interesting about it, it's new and it's not new. So I don't know if it's okay, I'm just going to summarize a couple things real quick. So, you know, like I said, these companies made commitments more than a decade ago through this thing called the Global Network Initiative to, Twitter did not, but Facebook and Google did, to stand in line with human rights frameworks. And most of them have failed on that. And a lot of this really began happening around 2012. I remember this post that Twitter put out in 2011 during the Arab Spring that was like, the tweets must flow. And then a year later, they responded to takedown requests from Russia and Pakistan, and then said, you know, oh, the tweets must still flow, but actually we gotta take down this stuff and we're not sure. And so, you know, these companies have kind of been capitulating to, or not kind of been, they have been capitulating to authoritarian governments for a long time. Most of them take down speech at the request of Saudi Arabia, which is kind of unbelievable. And I saw this great tweet from Meera Shaki, who's on the real Oversight board. I'm always like, not the real one, the real one. But she said earlier today that you know, Facebook leaving over laws that it doesn't like in Australia implies that it supports the laws in countries like Turkey, where it does take down content. I thought that was such a salient point. Mm-hmm. You know, I've been saying to these companies, honestly, for 10 years, both publicly and privately, to resist these measures, and they choose not to because it's not good for their bottom line. And so with what's happening in India, what's interesting about it to me is, so Twitter has been responding to the government, the same government that, the ruling party. I know I'm going to get slammed on Twitter for saying this, but it's no surprise that the BJP has been using Twitter to engage in misinformation campaigns and hate speech. And yeah, definitely going to get slammed on Twitter now. But at the same time, Twitter is taking down content at the request of this government, that's being ruled by this party. And so they're in kind of this weird position, but over the past couple of days, we've seen them resisting, right? So they're starting to resist when the takedown requests relate to specific types of accounts, whether it's human rights activists, journalism, et cetera. And I think that's a really important move. And that's what's new here, or maybe not new, but it hasn't happened for a long time, right? And so that's what I want to see, more of us pushing these companies toward doing, is saying no. I've been telling them to say no. A lot of other people have too. And I think it's good that Twitter's starting to make this move. Let's hold their feet to the fire on that.
I mean, just to put in a small little plug for the Oversight Board at this point. I mean, all this is fascinating, and it's fascinating that you say Mark Zuckerberg doesn't believe in free speech, and we really don't want the Modi to determine the future of social platforms. In one of the little trial where we spent most of the summer doing test cases before we launched, and somebody in one of these test cases said, well, of course, if we did that would completely ruin Facebook's business model in these kind of countries. And the rest of us said, well, so what? That's not our problem. Literally, we have no economic stake in Facebook at all, and we just can approach it through the human rights lens that you say they've forgotten about. And I do think, again, you're going to have to give it time, but I do think we have the leeway to work in a way that completely disregards the economic model. It's not our concern.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think that's what does make the Oversight Board important here. I wish that, I kind of wish that some of the other companies were doing the same thing. There were ideas that were proposed that would be more universal than this. Article 19, the London-based organization, had proposed kind of an idea of social media councils that would be more broad. And I do think that, again, like anything like this that incorporates civil society is an important tool. I also just, with the companies on this matter, I think that one of their talking points on this has been for many years to say, but if we don't take down this content, even if it's completely like requests that violate human rights frameworks, such as, the ones in Turkey around criticism of Erdogan or Ataturk, if we don't take this stuff down, we'll get blocked. And that to me, the arrogance of that like, oh, we're so important in this country. And yet, they've made themselves so. And so it is a really tricky proposition, but at the same time, like, they made this mess. It's time for them to fix it.
I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting with the Twitter, and the point you made, Carol, is about solidarity amongst journalists and amongst media organizations. So when you have a situation, the situation had in Twitter where the Caravan had its Twitter account blocked, to have that reported in other media, both inside India and outside, is really, really important, and really shouldn't be underestimated. Everything I kind of do on press freedom when I speak to journalists and say, what do you need? What they need more than anything, beyond, they need protection and not to be imprisoned, but they also just really need solidarity and visible public shows of solidarity from other media and other journalists as well. It's been a really fascinating talk, and I've kept everyone almost past their bedtime. Thank you so much, all three of you, for this conversation. I really wanted to add in a lot of light on so many topics. You both all been incredibly generous with your time. Thank you as well to Dorothy Byrne for putting this together, and James Ball for fielding all the questions. Sorry I didn't get to all the questions, but I think the panel did kind of cover a lot of the themes that a lot of people have been asking about. And Hannah, thank you again, and over back to you.
Thanks ever so much, Meera. We really appreciate you moderating this in such a brilliant and calm way after our initial technical hitches. So thank you. And to Alan, to Carol, to Jillian, we appreciate your time as well. This panel will be available on YouTube within the next week or so. We'll also have an audio version of it, and we do hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any other questions for us or any other comments you'd like to make, please join us on Twitter. We're at EJ Network. Until the next time, thanks ever so much and enjoy the rest of your evening.